Ottawa imposed an export ban on potatoes from the island to the U.S. That was back in November due to the unsightly but harmless wart.
Just like the seafood industry, PEI potato growers want an end to this too, and they hope that pressure from American farmers will turn the tide on tariffs.
Tonight, many of America's farmers already feeling the pinch are worried about the possibility of more challenges.
Very significant market, long-term relationships there. Anything that would impact that is obviously
The global trade relationship between Canada and the United States has long been one of the most integrated in the world. The two nations share the longest undefended border and decades of economic cooperation across agriculture, energy, manufacturing, and natural resources. Yet, even the most stable partnerships can face tension when politics and strategic interests begin to reshape the rules of trade. Recently, something as simple as a potato has moved unexpectedly to the center of a wider economic debate. The issue began when Ottawa imposed an export ban on potatoes from Prince Edward Island to the United States in response to agricultural concerns. What initially appeared to be a limited and temporary decision quickly grew into a broader conversation about trade leverage, supply chain dependence, and economic sovereignty. Farmers on both sides of the border suddenly found themselves watching developments closely, realizing that the outcome could affect long-standing agricultural relationships. For decades, the North American potato industry has operated as a tightly integrated system. Canadian farms produce large volumes of potatoes that are processed into frozen French fries and exported across the border. These fries supply many of the largest American fast food chains and restaurants. In fact, Canada exports roughly $2.7 billion worth of frozen fries each year, and historically, nearly 90% of that production has been sold in the United States. On the other side, American buyers import about 1.4 million tons of frozen fries annually, with approximately 1.2 million tons coming from Canadian processors. That level of reliance has shaped business strategies and long-term contracts across the industry. The supply chain itself is highly coordinated. Potatoes are grown in regions such as Prince Edward Island, Alberta, and Manitoba. After harvest, they are transported to large processing facilities where they are cut, frozen, packaged, and loaded onto refrigerated trucks. These trucks cross the border in massive numbers every year, delivering products to distribution centers across the United States. For many years, the system worked so smoothly that few people imagined it could face disruption. However, changing political pressures began to challenge those assumptions. Former U.S. President Donald Trump argued that American food security should prioritize reliable access to Canadian agricultural products. In his view, resources that were essential to the American food industry should remain available to U.S. buyers even during periods of economic tension. Some proposals suggested giving American companies guaranteed priority access to Canadian agricultural exports. From Washington's perspective, the argument was rooted in economic security. American restaurant chains had built their supply models around Canadian inputs, and any disruption could affect pricing, supply stability, and long-term planning. At the same time, similar tactics had appeared in other trade disputes involving oil, steel, lumber, and critical minerals. The strategy was simple: identify resources that U.S. industries rely on and use market access as leverage in negotiations. Canada responded cautiously but firmly. Prime Minister Mark Carney emphasized that while Canada values trade with the United States, national resources would ultimately be managed according to Canadian priorities. Canadian potatoes would continue to be exported, but under standard commercial conditions rather than guaranteed arrangements tied to political demands. The message was clear: trade would remain open, but it would not be dictated by outside pressure. Behind this response was a broader strategy that had already been developing for years. Canadian agricultural leaders had begun expanding their global reach in order to reduce dependence on a single export market. With demand for convenience foods rising worldwide, frozen potato products have become increasingly popular in emerging markets. Canadian producers have been building new relationships across Asia. growers from Prince Edward Island have explored opportunities in countries such as Indonesia and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations region. These markets are experiencing rapid urban growth and a rising middle class, both of which drive demand for fast food products and frozen foods. Canada has also negotiated trade frameworks with Indonesia that aim to reduce tariffs and improve agricultural market access. Meanwhile, Canada continues to expand trade ties with established markets. Japan already imports significant quantities of Canadian frozen fries, and demand there continues to grow. European markets offer another major opportunity. Belgium is one of the world's largest potato importers, while France is a leading exporter in the global potato trade. Canadian producers see these regions as promising alternatives that can reduce reliance on a single buyer. Every new export agreement changes the balance slightly. Each shipment that goes to Asia, Europe, or Latin America reduces the automatic share once assumed by American buyers. For decades, U.S. restaurant chains benefited from a predictable supply system built around Canadian agriculture. Now that predictability is being challenged. Large American fast food companies do not typically grow their own potatoes. Instead, they depend on a network of suppliers, processors, and farmers. When those suppliers begin diversifying their customer base internationally, it introduces new competition for the same resources. Canadian processors may now weigh offers from multiple global markets rather than prioritizing American demand by default. The impact is already visible in subtle ways. Some companies have begun adjusting procurement strategies, reviewing supply contracts, and preparing for potential price fluctuations. In certain markets, restaurants have introduced smaller portion sizes or modest price increases as a way to manage rising supply costs. Franchise owners are also paying closer attention to delivery schedules and inventory management. At the same time, Canadian producers see diversification as a form of economic protection. When a supplier depends overwhelmingly on a single buyer, that buyer holds significant influence. But when the supplier develops multiple markets across continents, the balance of negotiating power begins to change. Contracts signed in Asia, Europe, and Latin America provide alternatives if trade tensions with the United States intensify. The broader lesson extends beyond agriculture. Canadian policymakers have begun applying the same principle across several sectors. Natural resources such as oil, electricity, lumber, freshwater, and critical minerals are increasingly framed as strategic assets. Ottawa has made it clear that these resources will be managed according to domestic priorities, not external pressure. The frozen fry dispute may seem minor compared with conflicts over pipelines or energy exports, but it highlights how deeply interconnected modern supply chains have become. Something as ordinary as a fast food side dish can reveal the fragile balance that underpins international trade. For American consumers, the visible effects may appear small: slightly higher prices, occasional sourcing changes, or shifts in supply logistics. But beneath those adjustments lies a deeper transformation. Canadian producers are no longer viewing the U.S. market as their only path to success. Instead, they see it as one important option among many. That change in perspective alters every negotiation moving forward. When tariff threats appear, Canadian exporters can point to growing international demand. When calls for guaranteed access emerge, they can emphasize open markets and competitive trade. The balance of influence becomes more even, though the relationship remains complex. Ultimately, the potato dispute illustrates a larger reality about modern economic partnerships. Interdependence can bring efficiency and prosperity, but it can also create vulnerabilities when political pressure enters the equation. When one side attempts to use supply chains as leverage, the other side often responds by seeking independence. In this case, Canadian potatoes will likely continue crossing the border into the United States, just as they have for decades. But the conditions surrounding that trade are changing. Instead of automatic priority, American buyers now compete alongside customers from across the global market. What began as a disagreement over agricultural exports has evolved into a broader reflection on trade strategy, economic sovereignty, and the future of North American supply chains. And if something as common as French fries can become a symbol of geopolitical tension, it raises an important question. Which resource might become the next focal point in the evolving economic relationship between Canada and the United States? Thanks for watching Scarlet Drive, and see you next time. Share your experiences and opinions in the comments below. If you found this discussion enlightening, don't forget to subscribe to Scarlet Drive for the latest news and insights.